everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's me, Diana Perry Cruz.
And it's me, Jackie. Hello.
How's everybody doing on this somewhat wet, where we are at least, spring day? Just a little damp, I guess. You sound amazing. Well, welcome to our show. It's not a weather show. It's a show about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic and then discuss some relevant research articles. And sometimes we pick a topic based on listener requests. Sometimes we pick a topic because it's something we want to talk about. Sometimes we reach out and we have a guest and we're like, we need this guest on. Hey, special guest, what do you want to talk about? And that's one of these episodes too. We're very lucky. It's a topic that I think a lot of people have been also asking for. So we got a nice Venn diagram there, but we are very, very excited to have on John Staubitz. John, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk to us about, I didn't even say what the topic. That's the guest. I introduced the guest because that's who we wanted on first. And then John was like, I'll talk about something, whatever. And then I came up with a great topic. John, do you want to introduce the topic that we'll be talking about today?
Sure. And thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be on with you guys. I love the podcast. It's great to be here. We're going to talk about practicing within a school context for those BCBAs and RBTs listening.
That's good. So, and we didn't even know that. We just were like, John, get on the show, get on right now. And he jumped on and we're like, come on, what do you got? And we no. This is a planned episode, just like always, but we are very excited to have John on. John, again, if you remember back in the archives, we had John's wife, Joey Staubitz, on talking about the enhanced choice model. We've gotten to know both of them at various conferences. And so John has been on our list of, we got to get John on. So we had a good scheduling moment where it all worked out. And we're very excited to talk about this topic because for many of you, if you've listened to the show, know that we do, often talk about schools. That's my primary area of interest. And a lot of the resources I know I've been looking at over the past few years have come directly from links John has sent me. So I'm very excited to talk about this in depth. I'm serious, John, like the one you sent me last year for a lot of the work with sort of, classroom management systems and routines. I've got that link. It sits in my inbox, like at the bottom of the screen, so I can pull it up at any second. So everyone's going to get to hear all these exciting
It's waiting in the wings at all times.
Tips and tricks today. Very excited.
I'm so glad to hear that. I got to send you some new stuff. So we'll talk afterwards. So got some goodies.
So John, for folks who, before we just start talking, like, because we've known each other for a little while now, we've talked about these topics, we should probably bring all of the listeners in on the conversation. So before we talk about what articles we'll be discussing in the, this sort of general theme of practicing within a school context, please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to, be interested in this area of practice.
Sure. So I'm the Director of Behavior Analysis and Education, and that is at Triad, which is Vanderbilt University Medical Center's Autism Institute in Nashville, Tennessee. And currently, most of the work I do is directing a multi-year contract that's focused on severe behavior in schools and really focusing on Tier 3. And that we're in year 4 of a 5-year contract. It's with the Tennessee Department of Education. And they created a technical assistance network, and we are the partner that focuses on Tier 3 behavior. So that's my current job. Tell more about it if you like.
Well, John, because I don't think I've ever asked you this. So now you're trapped and you have to answer the question. How did you get interested specifically in like the education and the severe behavior treatment component of education for your career path?
Sure. So I'll try to be short in the first part. I basically, as a teen, I just got really interested in volunteering at a camp for kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities, autism, emotional disturbance. That was kind of my summertime outlet starting when I was 13. And I remember like my first few minutes at the camp, there was a kid who was, spitting on me and kicking me and stuff like that. And I was like, this is really an interesting challenge. It just felt really, and like a lot of the kids I worked with had pretty severe behavior needs. And I think I found that to be actually more attractive than not, or than some other sorts of issues. So I was really drawn to behavior. Kind of moving forward, by the time I was looking for colleges, I knew I wanted to study special education. And luckily for me, I grew up in Cincinnati, and Ohio State University had a decent special education program at that time, and it was affordable. So did my undergrad in special education. Serendipitously, partway through that program, I was introduced to ABA. One of the requirements was that I take an intro to ABA course. It was taught by the fabulous Stephanie Peterson, and I was really just hooked from, class 1, thinking to be a classroom teacher for kids who present with severe behavior. I'm realizing this is something I need to learn more about. I was really fortunate. That undergrad program, they worked in, I think, maybe 3 or 4 master's level courses in ABA. So I think by the time I left, it had some courses from like Tim Herron on school-based consultation. And it's, wow, this is so cool. Or like Pam Osnes talking about generalization. And so it was really, that was a huge gift. At the same time, I took a job just because I wanted to learn more about ABA. I took a job working for, at the time it was called Columbus Children's Hospital, now it's Nationwide Children's Hospital. But they had an autism center there, and they were doing a lot of, it was kind of a replication site for a lot of the Lovaas work. The director there, Jackie Nguyen, had been, I think, Ivar Lovaas's associate director at some point in LA. So I think I ended up with an introduction to a decent brand, I guess, of EIBI and some other sort of work. And I did a lot of work in college, volunteering at a middle school for kids with emotional disturbance. So I also was pretty interested in that population. So that was the first part. I'll take a breath.
Ooh, excellent.
That's good. That's a very well-rounded background.
I know, and I think we'll kind of come back to how some of us get into the educational part of behavior analysis, because as we'll be talking about, it's one of those things that some of us just sort of wind up doing, and we're like, wait a minute, I don't know a lot about schools. How did I get here? And I do. There is something. Maybe it's because we're all getting older, but there is that sort of Wild Westness of certain parts of the field where nobody knew any better. So we sort of shrugged and carried on. But sadly, if you're listening to this and you're in graduate school now, we've all learned a lot since then. So you don't get the same excuse that we did of like, well, who else is going to do it? Whoopsies. And you kind of have to know this stuff ahead of time. But lucky for you, we now have more resources than we did then.
And that's a great point, because I really felt I was really into social justice in undergrad, and I was kind of like, it was already apparent to me that students with emotional disturbance labels or emotional behavior disorders weren't getting a fair shake from an advocacy or intervention standpoint. So I felt like, I want to get to this population in the schools they are, but there was no ABA to be seen anywhere there. So I was like, I'm going to spend some time doing this job in ABA, see what I can learn, and then see if I can kind of import it. Hopefully there'll be some tactics or some technologies that could be applied for this other population.
So John has shared some relevant research articles to this topic. Diana, what are the articles that we're going to be discussing today?
Okay, we have a whole selection of articles to talk about today, and they include Applied Behavior Analysis, Students with Autism and the Requirement to Provide a Free, Appropriate Public Education by Stevenson and Correa. That was published in the Journal of Disability Policy Studies, 2019. Also, the follow-up, Still Left Behind, How Behavior Analysts Can Improve Children's Access, Equity, and Inclusion to Their Entitled Education by Stevenson, Bethune, and Gardner. That was published in Behavior Analysis and Practice, I think 2024. Yeah, 2024. I think that those will likely make up the bulk of our conversation. And then we have 2 gravy articles as well. Navigating Collaboration, Factors Influencing Special Education Teachers' Relationships with BCBAs in Diverse School Contexts by Squires, Coutre, Parega, Morris, Ellsworth, Miller, and Hansen. That was in BAP 2024. And finally, Preparation of Behavior Analysts for School-Based Practice by Copeland, Duffy, and Mays in Behavior Analysis and Practice 2024, Sensing a Theme here.
The theme would be in the title of the episode. Would be so bad if we picked 4 articles,
wait
nothing to do with the title. I don't know what we were thinking.
How are we going to pull this off?
John, one of the themes, I don't want to jump too far ahead in the articles that we'll be talking about, but one of the themes, I think, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, is, boy, behavior analysis sure has a lot to share with education, and boy, BCBAs sure learn a lot about behavior analysis, but not a lot about education and educational systems. And boy, I bet nobody likes that clash of different sciences, do they? So I know we'll be talking a lot about that idea, but I'm hoping that, some of the initial questions I had, even though I think they're kind of probably a little more basic, I think are very needed for most of the audience in terms of some of like the general nomenclature that we use in education, some of the history involved, some of the bigger, like big picture issues that we can, we'll be able to delve into a few of them in more depth in the context of our episode. But just in general, how have you seen the challenges that face schools today, improving, not improving, based on sort of where you started in schools back at the beginning of your career?
Sure. Yeah. And I guess I should say, I think there's 2 ways we can look at this. I think one is looking at kind of beyond special education. I think there's some challenges in education in general that really affect special education affect the parts where behavior analysts are tending to work. And I think there's some that are really specific to behavior. So on the beyond special ed side, I mean, I think education in general is underfunded. I think the teacher shortages are seen in every state where there's people I've spoken to. I think special interests have had a lot of an impact on it. I think anything from, publishing companies for assessments to textbooks, I think they've had a big role in it. I think inequality across the education system, across a variety of parameters, has been a big issue. I think political churn has been a big one. I think that shifting priorities either, for leadership in school systems or state or federal, I think has made it tricky. And I think final thing is I think there's been really unrealistic expectations for education in general. I think that we've looked at just a whole range of societal challenges and we've thought, well, if no one else does it, hopefully education does. And while it does seem like a bummer to say, well, let's just let some of these problems sit there and no one works on it. I do think that can be a distraction or can kind of beat down people in education a bit when they're like, wow, we're failing at solving all these other issues that education isn't really set up for. It's like we're not really at a strategic advantage for those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does feel like education sort of becomes the place where it is the easiest in some ways to access all the services, but you're dealing with a lot of professionals who have one area of expertise and they're expected to be experts in like 5 or 6. There's not, and then like you said, add on strained resources. And I think that's led to, how many articles have we read? My school system started the year off with a graph on here's where everyone's burnout is, and almost felt like they're like, please stay the rest of the day. I swear this year is going to be better. And in some ways it has been, in some ways I think it's still the same churn, the same challenges that are not necessarily local challenges. They're, federal or they're state level challenges.
Yeah, I think there'll be things like, someone comes on board and they're the new educational hotshot, and whether they're at a, let's just say if they're at a state level or something like that, like they'll have all these promises, they'll take all the money and put it towards the things they're into. And by the time anyone could look at results to see if it worked or not, they've already moved on to the next stepping stone. And so I think that happens a lot. I think that makes it hard for educators. Also too, like one of the societal things, I went on from the Ohio State thing and came to Vanderbilt and got my BCBA while getting teacher licensure because I knew I wanted to teach. And I remember my first year teaching, I had a self-contained class for students with emotional behavior disorders in 2nd through 4th grade. I remember the principal telling me, what we're finding is he's like, I'm not so concerned about students who are living below the poverty line, because they had a lot of students there who were eligible for free and reduced meals and stuff like that. He said the problem is, it's all like the families getting moved around, getting evicted and so on. He's like, we can have a student who shows up here with a lot of needs, but if they hang in there for the 4 or 5 years I'm here, we get to know them, we figure out we build those relationships, we're able to get a beat on how to help. But he's like, the problem is, these kids just disappear and show up, et cetera. And again, I think that's a bit of a societal thing. I think it's really hard to afford to live in America. It's hard to find a place where you can be safe and, keep a roof over your head. And I think that it makes it harder for educators to do their thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely does seem like the challenge of special education itself is its own, long history where things have gone badly, things have gone better, things have taken back, gone backwards. And then when you're adding on special education plus, unhoused populations, plus a lot of the, refugee populations coming into the school systems, who everyone wants to support, but you're dealing with individuals with a trauma background, possibly with special education needs that you can't even assess because the language needs and the sort of mental health needs need to be sort of addressed at the same time. It really does just increasingly feel like, I don't want to say losing battle, because I still go to work not every day, but every day that school is in session, I show up.
Winnie feels like it. Okay.
But it's very some days. But it definitely is just a series of challenges, some of which we have more mandates for, which again, we talk about reinforcement, or where's your reinforcement coming from? Where's your punishment coming from? Mm-hmm. You have leadership that's interested in this objective versus that objective, like you mentioned. And then where do the results come in? Not everyone has the same level of data education. And, certainly I think behavior analysts have a really important part to play. Sometimes I wonder if the part we would play isn't the one that we often are cast into, of like, these kids are throwing things, figure that one out. I think there's other pieces we could really do more at a bigger picture level.
I 100% agree. And I guess I was kind of leading with things that we have less than we can influence, but I think some ones that are closer in, I think there is more we can do. And I think, obviously we'll get into this more, but I hope there's a message for hope of hope for people who are thinking about this. I hope that this will make analysts be more inspired. So I think that some of the real specific barriers or challenges I'm seeing within, let's say, severe behavior in schools, some of the big stuff is crisis situations, to the extent to which there are, physical altercations. Looked at some data a couple of years ago, and just to look at the hundreds of students who are hurt each year, the hundreds of staff members who are hurt each year. It's a big deal. Encounters with law enforcement, to the extent that there's arrests or, kind of building a history that's kind of toxic between students and law enforcement, I think it's a huge issue. I know we'll talk about it in one of the articles that exclusionary discipline is a huge issue that Tennessee is trying to deal with, and I suspect other states are too, and I think based on what we're seeing in the literature. So we're talking about suspensions, we're talking about send homes, where it's kind of an undocumented suspension, and it's extremely difficult data to keep a handle on. Shortened school days, where someone's saying we're basically shortening the school day in the hopes that they'll be safer. And I think there's ways for that to be done responsibly, and that's where analysts can play a tremendous role. But I think that it can get misused. And then students being placed on homebound, which it was interesting. It came up in one of the articles. We saw a huge uptick in that during and post-COVID. I think that schools, they were relying more on medical homebound. They were mixing in some behavior homebound. And it seems like that's kind of a more heavily used tool than ever before. And I think that we're seeing that's a problem that I think analysts can really help with. How do we get kids back onto campus in a manner that might be data-based and responsible and they're ready for it? I think that all those lead to lack of educational progress, of course, and then data that we've seen from our State Department of Education, there's an extremely high correlation between those students who face exclusionary discipline and those who drop out. It's an extremely high correspondence. So literally, if we want people to graduate and finish, we got to find things to do for them other than just sending them home or kicking them out or putting them homebound.
Yeah. So, John, I'd love to kind of take a trip in the Wayback Machine. And I know a lot of the articles discussed, one of the key areas that a lot of behavior analysts who say, I'm going to go into schools. I love school. I want to support kids in schools. I think this is a good place, whether it's special ed, whether it's general ed, working with the autistic students, whether it's working with emotional behavior students. That's where I want to be. They often enter as amazing as you can be after you've just graduated a program and have maybe had your 2 years of practicum, as good as you can be, top of your class, right? With no knowledge of what actually goes on in a school. What are the requirements in a school that go beyond just, say, the BCBA ethics code and, the ethics of being in a school, the ethics of education, the legal ramifications. So I'd love to sort of get your sort of, quick and dirty review of like what has special education sort of looked like over time, and sort of where are we now in terms of those requirements? Like, you should know these acronyms and you should understand that we're here because kind of things.
Yeah, the funny thing is, like,
soup.
It is an alphabet soup. The funny thing, I'm not ashamed to admit this, but it's like, I had courses both in undergrad and grad school where they talked a lot about sped law, and I feel like I don't know that I necessarily had the right background to even really appreciate how important it is. Like, I still feel like I'm still reading stuff, and I was like, oh, like it actually does all make sense, but I think it's taking me a long time to get there. So I completely understand if analysts, whether or not they're being trained in education, like, might feel like, how the heck does this stuff help? But I think, like, the big takeaways are, there's a federal mandate for students to receive a free and appropriate public education. And so when you hear people say FAPE, that's what they're talking about. Now, that term is about as gray as any kind of legalese things you're going to see. But I think that the case law over the years, I think when the articles we're going to talk about, there's a point where it was basically, I think like one of the standards they used to say is like, you're entitled to a Chevrolet, but not a Cadillac. Like, basically, like, being able to be educated at all is kind of good enough, but don't expect it to be anything really special. And I think some subsequent decisions, I think, have actually said there needs to be progress, and progress meaningful to the individual, especially if we're talking about someone where we're not going to see progress on state testing or achievement testing. So that's a good one. I think LRE, or least restrictive environment, is an extremely important one for analysts to know. And that's where, we usually talk about students are entitled to receive FAPE in their LRE, meaning as close as possible to where their educational experience would be if they weren't eligible for special education supports. And that is necessarily a continuum, or should be a continuum. But I think that where analysts can really play a role is that through the right behavioral accommodations or supports, or by us building the right skills, we can make it such that a child who would otherwise struggle in a less restrictive setting is now successful there. And I think that's where, that's the difference between a kid being on homebound or being on campus or needing to be in a special day program or placement or being, alongside their peers. So I think those are important ones for people to know. And I guess also the IEP, or individualized education program. Hopefully a lot of analysts know that one, but it's I think it's one of the places where analysts can also play a really important role. So each student in special education has an IEP, and it really is supposed to be a reflection of, as we look across the child's performance right now, where do we see the sorts of performance deficits for which specialized supports are needed? Let's document those. Let's make sure we have goals that would basically create a pathway for them to move from, a place of needing support towards, being integrated absent that support. And then I think the rest of the IEP is kind of talking about what are the tactics, what are the pledges to the family and the team through which we're going to get there with those goals. And there's a lot of details, what services, if there's a behavior intervention plan, that's going to be part of that. There's a lot of other pieces, but by and large, it's a pathway for them to get to their LRE.
Mm. And John, you mentioned it already, that gray area, because I think one of the other challenges that even if okay, I got my 3 ACRET, I got my IEP, I got FAPE, I got LRE, great, I'm probably ready to be in schools. And I think it was the Stevenson articles were really great at sort of doing the quick review of here's case law, here's some key case law. A lot of BCBAs reported that that's one of the areas they're like, I need more training in case law. I don't understand what that is. I know I got like rights law, it's on my bookshelf. Occasionally we'll flip through it.
Yeah. Remember, you and John, both of you have a background in special education. So both of you, your master's degrees are in special education. Jackie and I, our masters are in ABA. And so we got virtually zero background on special education law.
I actually only got special education law in one class in my doctoral program, albeit briefly, during behavior assessment. I read one book that had 2 chapters on special education law, and that was in my doctoral program.
I guess I want to be careful and not make it sound like, oh, well, there's just not that much to special ed law. I mean, I think there's some really important pieces, but I am struck by it's more or less the same cases that were being talked about 20 plus years ago. There's 1 or 2 additions. I think a lot of it is going to emerge now, especially with respect to behavior analysis. So when we'll talk to lead counsel at the Tennessee Department of Education, he'll say things like, all right, so the question is, ABA in schools, how's this going to look? And he'll be like, well, there's a case from Hawaii from a couple of years ago that's relevant, but he's like, I actually think that the litigation that's going to happen in Tennessee is it's somewhere in the pipeline now. We just haven't quite seen it yet. So all that to say for analysts, read that book, take that class. But I think that we've also got to stay tuned in, because I think that over the next few years, I think that there will be a lot of, changes.
Well, these Stevenson articles do a really nice job of summarizing the relevant case law
greatest hits.
Yeah. So check that out too, which is why you've recommended this article to us. But it's good.
Yeah, it's a good starting point. It's for analysts, so that's good. But I would say though, in terms of kind of history and some improvements. So I had this experience of, again, early on volunteering in Columbus Public Schools, and then moving to Tennessee and working in Nashville Public Schools. And then I took a little side trip and moved and lived in Southern California for a couple of years. And so then I was a classroom teacher in the Santa Monica Malibu Unified School District. And I consulted in the Manhattan Beach Unified School District. And what I found out there was the education system. I mean, obviously California is very different from Tennessee and Ohio for countless reasons. But it was so apparent to me that educational advocacy had made a huge, huge difference in terms of adherence to education law as well as behavior analysis. And it would strike, I had known that I could tell that a big reason why a lot of the students that I worked with weren't getting a fair shake was because they didn't have strong advocacy in their household or on their team. What I saw in California was students and families who didn't necessarily have a lot of personal resources, but because there had been such a strong advocacy community, they weren't getting messed with. Schools knew to not mess around. And I thought that was really striking. And it makes me feel like we're at the time thinking it wouldn't be nice if we just share with people what the right thing is to do. And I think, sharing is it, but advocacy is also a means of educating people and there being some accountability to it. And I do suspect that when we really see, and I know that came up in one of the articles, but I think when we really see education improving, it's going to be because there's advocacy and education, and people can't just say, oh, sounds great, maybe another time, but we must do this, and we got to find a way.
Yeah. John, one of the things that I know always, annoys me about legal cases and legal definitions is they're never really meant to be, it's a feature, not a bug, right? They're never meant to be this is exactly what it is. So FAPE looks exactly like this. And if it doesn't look exactly like this is wrong. which again is a strength because it allows for individualization to some extent of education. But I do think we see that pendulum swing of some years LRE and FAPE is more about the adaptive skills. Some years LRE and FAPE is about, no, everyone has to be getting the exact same education and learning Shakespeare. And if you're not doing that, it's not and really just finding that sweet spot. And something you said just now kind of made me think, when we're talking about BCBAs in schools, I think really our history of individualization really fits nicely with how we can provide advocacy for parents, how we can meet goals for students, and how we can work to define that with schools in a way that doesn't just result in what I think a lot of schools worry about is, well, this is watered down. I want the students to be challenged, but doing so much time on individualization, we know the challenge isn't just making everyone do exactly the same thing. Challenging is something that has to be individualized. I mean, does that kind of sit with sort of where, one role you think we could play?
Yeah. I mean, I think I love that framing. And I do think you're absolutely right. I don't see it as a bug. I think that individualization part, and I agree that if we just say, like, for instance, if we make some rule around what's more or less restrictive, there are going to be places where it doesn't make sense. So here's an example. I was in a meeting last week with some special ed leads for a large urban school system. And they said, like at this point, we're having some budgetary struggles because of the number of one-on-one assistants we've assigned. And they said, if I could go back in time, I do wonder, would we have come out ahead if we had applied having RBTs and BCBAs instead, put our budget there, built up the skills of these students, and now those students can be integrated without having to have someone there. But you go back in time, and the thought was this child could be in a gen ed classroom with an ancillary aid. I mean, is that more integrated than them, us gambling that if we do some pull-out work and build up their skills, they'll be there without the aid later? I mean, on the one hand, there was not the access to BCBAs and RBTs when they were making those decisions. So, I mean, it is a different landscape now. But also, too, it's hard to know. And part of it might also be some school system might say, if you have people you can hire into that, if you have a budget for it, great. But otherwise, that might not even be on the table. So I think that's where we have to have that individualization, so we don't write law such that, you could write half the country out of compliance just by writing something like every child who has this must have this, and it's an unfunded mandate, and all of a sudden everybody's sued. And like, are you helping anything? So that's, yeah. But I think analysts, though, again, we can look for responsible ways to deal with it. It's like, for instance, if looking at one of those issues I brought up earlier, like there was a student I worked with a couple of years ago who, we did some analyses. This was a young man where when he had a violent episode, I mean, he was the size of a UFC heavyweight, and it would take, people always got hurt. He had the wrestling coach as his teacher, like, 4 or 5 adults would be engaged in these crisis situations. Someone's always going to the ER. And so we were able to really make a lot of headway and find he could have a safe 4 hours at school, but all of his problems would happen in the afternoon. He was a man-sized high schooler, and he would not eat at school. And they tried every single thing they could do to find, bring his favorite food, have his mom deliver it, whatever. He wouldn't eat. And so I assume if this guy had low blood sugar and was getting hangry, like, they shortened his day, and as a result, no longer had crisis situations, and were looking for ways to bring him back. Is that not LRE? Is that irresponsible? I don't think so. They used their data to make the call. They were looking for ways to bring him back. They'd made good faith efforts to get at the root of it and were unsuccessful. And so again, I think the moral is there. I mean, just because my team was involved with it doesn't make it better. But I think that had my RBT and I not been involved, who knows? Maybe we would have just been expelled. Or who knows? Maybe they would have shortened his day down so he could only come an hour a day, and he would have missed out on, the extra hours that he was able to benefit from when we actually made a database choice and had some interventions in place.
Yeah. John, I love that example. I think when we're talking about, a role that BCBAs could play in schools that isn't just like, well, you're the specialist in charge of our autism program or our emotional behavior program, is that data literacy, that function-based decision-making. Because, you think about, like you said, that same case where the student was based on data, it did appear to be, the correlation between the food, blood sugar, that 4 hours was kind of a max before, if he wasn't going to be able to eat, had to go somewhere else to eat. Otherwise, it was not going to be successful. There was going to be danger. Very different than, I don't know, it seems like around 1 is when this kid starts losing it. So let's just say the day ends at 1, right? Those are the exact same, topography of decision, but 2 very different cases. And I think when we look at when do school systems get sued, in the one hand, you have a very long case. And I'm sure you were communicating with the family, sharing that information throughout the process, as opposed to just like, hi, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. By the way, we're changing your kid's plan to just have them go home at 1 because it's too unsafe. Big shrug, the end, right? It's so different, but it's such a subtle a subtle difference in many ways. I'm sure it didn't feel subtle to you and your team who were doing all this extra work, but as an outsider, you could read that case and be mad about it right off the bat, unless you know all the work that went into it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of times when I say, or people read collaboration, we're thinking about like professional, but yeah, like what I found is, collaborating and getting families involved in those. Again, if people have enough information, we're not always going to agree, but it's so much easier, if it's more of a kind of an information-based sort of decision. And I think I've seen a lot of families really come to the table around some really challenging situations, and it kind of accepts some procedures that are highly individualized because they can make sense of it. There's some safeguards. There's some commitments from the team on what their data decision rules will be. Things like I've seen parents who will say, I'm okay with shortening my kid's day, provided that we're going to review every X number of days, provided that, 2 weeks with stability at this data level, we're automatically adding another 15 minutes without an IEP meeting. Basically, like there's not some scenario where my kid's just languishing and that's that, that we're going to keep pushing. And so I think that's, or even just showing a pledge to what supports and procedures are going to be in place and there being credibility. There was another case I worked, it was right in the middle of COVID actually, so a lot of this is teleconsultation, but I talked to this grandma who had a reputation for just being really, really difficult to deal with. And I talked to her, there are two big themes. She's like, nobody tells me anything. And whenever I tell people what I want, they don't listen. And I was like, wow, you can kind of sum up there. Those are like, like any guardian is going to be so sad and frustrated and infuriated and not feeling like, what should you agree to if you feel like you don't have the information? And even if you did, if you said your piece, people would discount it. So we can all do better.
Hi, do you want to be a BCBA, also known as a board certified behavior analyst?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts to get your graduate degree just minutes outside of Boston.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education, dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years.
And our 2022 graduates had a 92% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy approved fieldwork placements, ethics mini handbooks, PhD levels professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland if interested.
And don't forget, our program is accredited by the Association of Behavior Analysis International, or ABAI, as a Tier 1 master's degree program.
Don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu.
regiscollege.edu.
One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there.
Bye.
Hey, everybody. Sorry to pause the episode for just 1 second, but I wanted to remind all of our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. By listening to this episode, you can earn 1 Learning CE. All you need to do is finish listening to our discussion with John Staubitz and go to our website, abainsidetrack.com. You can click a link in your podcast player to take you right there. When you're there, you'll need to enter some key information, including our 2 secret code words, courtesy of special guest John Staubitz. The first of those code words is parkour. Parkour. It's like when you're trying to move through a space as efficiently as possible, usually by doing awesome flips and stunts. Parkour. All right, back to the show. John, and we talked about sort of like our, history with individualization, certainly knowledge of functions of behavior, setting up data systems. Are there any other sort of strengths, just like, regardless of, I think, the concern about level of competence, if you just plunked a BCBA down into the middle of the average public school system, are there any other sort of skills that you feel a history of behavior analysis or training in behavior analysis just really brings to the educational system that just like, oh, this is such a great addition to that setting beyond, needing to know about education, which we do, but
Yeah. So I love this question. And I think I'm pondering this. I think one of them is, I think the deterministic worldview that analysts bring and kind of our commitment to analytical problem solving, I think has set us up to become really fluent with a couple sorts of activities that I think, can be beneficial, according to different problems or different contexts. So I think like analysts I think can have a strength on problem identification. Can we get this group to agree what's the main thing we're trying to do here? I think that a root cause analysis process in which we look at all different variables, and it doesn't have to be things that we're, an expert in. I think the new state board rule around functional behavior assessment in Tennessee is that during the FBA, you have to document any suspected areas of deficit that might be impacting behavior. So the analyst may not be the one who's done the assessment, but if the team believes that problem behavior mostly happens in contexts where reading and writing is a thing, there are some, quantified deficits in literacy or in writing, that therefore that's going to go on record through the FBA process. If it wasn't a goal already in the IEP, it has to be dealt with. And the analyst can bring, again, that root cause analysis part and say, even if I'm not the one who did the assessment, even if I'm not the one who's going to teach them, their literacy skills, it's relevant to their behavior. I have the data to show that, and I'm committing to our team pursuing that. I think analysts are very fluent with hypothesis development and hypothesis testing in applied contexts. And the fourth of these, I think, is just kind of these initial kind of skills is database progress monitoring and decision making, which we just talked about. That is something that most analysts are pretty comfortable with adapting and individualizing. And schools need that so badly in so many ways. I think like within behavior analysis philosophically, our emphasis is on learning. And I think that's so well suited to like teaching concepts and tactics to educators. If there's an educator who has been extraordinarily successful for the last 10 years, a student shows up who's unlike anyone they've ever met before, and they need to learn a couple of new behaviors that allow them to be successful, we can use behavioral skills training or another method of our choice to help them get there and get those skills in the repertoire. I think that analysts, whether or not they're taught about school-based consultation, I think we've been trained as consultants, and I think that's something that schools need. And I think just something we've already talked about a couple of times, just assisting in individualization of supports, and with an eye on efficiency, with an eye on generalization and sustainability, I think is important. So.
Well, I love all those. I love all those. And listeners, if you've been having a bad day, I hope that cheers you up, and you're going to your schools. But it's time to flip a little bit. So if you're having a bad day, I'm going to pause, come back to this episode later, because we need to talk about what is it that behavior analysts are doing in schools that you've found that either through lack of training, through maybe too much of a focus on database decision making, or folks who are sort of still stuck in the idea that our ethics code beats everyone else's ethics code. What are we doing that kind of shoots ourselves in the foot in terms of bringing behavior analysis more mainstream in the educational setting?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on. I think some of it is that for analysts, I think we kind of make some assumptions around why we're there. So like one of the articles said, like, did teachers want the person there? We found, it's not unusual for a SPED director to say this teacher needs help. The analyst shows up and the teacher's like, what are you doing here? But I think like in general, it doesn't really matter who invited you in. I think that it's worth it for people to ask the question, what do these people want from me? And I think a lot of analysts' default setting has unfortunately been, they have me here because of my brain. I'm just so freaking smart. Or they have me here because I've got that behavioral vocab, or because like families will be intimidated when I roll up and like I show them graphs they can't understand and say words they don't understand. I think, but I literally think that some analysts, I think there's some things that analysts do that are specifically to tact that we know. I know something you don't know. And I think that I don't think that's why people have us there. I think in most cases, they have us there because they want our help. And the nature of that help, you're only going to find out through asking. And sometimes that's asking in a couple different ways. Sometimes it's checking for correspondence. Sometimes different people have different reasons why they want you there. And you're going to have to do a little bit of fancy footwork to try to figure out, well, where will we start? But I think on the individual level, it's one of the big issues. I think ABA is part of the problem too. And I think that I think that with ABA, we talk about like this monolithic thing, but I think you could say there's a whole area of ABA that's the theory of the ABA. And of course, there's courses on this, right? There's the science of ABA. There's the practice of ABA. There's the business of ABA. I think we are being really, really fast and loose with conflating all those. So we'll show up at a school. We'll say, I'm going to tell you some stuff that's from the science of ABA. And we don't tell them that because the business of ABA, it's like good for me to have a 40-hour program because that's going to help me to optimize my earnings. And so there's all this stuff that we're not really telling them. An analyst comes in and says, oh, this kid's engaged in head-directed SIB. You know what? I've got some evidence-based recommendations. Escape extinction. There's hundreds of articles going back to the last 50 years showing this is the way to go, not pointing out that there's not a study showing that happening in a public school without university-based people there, without the right protective equipment and protocols. We're like, this science says it. This is evidence-based. And I really think we're setting ourselves up there for people to get, ineffectual suggestions conflicting advice, because for a while we're like extinction, and now we're like, I don't know. Like we now understand why teachers weren't really interested in that pill. And some of it just ends up, what we're saying, it's just nonsensical for the context or the individuals we're talking about. Like we're suggesting stuff that makes sense if someone's inpatient at a facility for 6 months,
right,
but doesn't make sense if this is like period 3 and you've got 16 other kids.
Yep. I'm just going to jump in and say I love how you laid all of that out, and I think that it's highly relevant. I talk about this as well in terms of, I say there's a science of behavior analysis, and that's what all of our research is based in. But what we're actually out there doing is the application of behavior analysis to socially significant challenges, and that it requires a whole different interpretation of what we know about our science. It's not automatically applicable in all of these different settings. That's where the art of what it is that we do comes into play, and having an understanding of what's going to be appropriate in varied settings.
I think you're so right. I think you're so right. Like what I'm realizing is like, you'll hear analysts like argue with each other, argue with other people, and like you can win an argument by like conflating all that stuff together. Like you can be like, of course, ABA is, trauma informed because like, look at this like really, sensitive and beautiful quote from Don Baer or something like that. And you're like, okay, cool. But like, we're kind of playing games here. You're winning the argument, but we're not winning the hearts and minds. If we show up and again, like act like, what I'm telling you, it's going to be compassionate because there are analysts out there who are compassionate. It's going to be science-based because there's some really tight efficacy science on this. It's like, it's just not all the same.
Yeah.
I know. John, what you were just describing, I think that idea, the conflicting information, I feel like I've been in schools for a very long time. And I have seen, and it is very exciting to see, like there's a kind of a literacy and an understanding of functions of behavior that I didn't see when I first started back in kind of the early 2000s up to now, where teachers get, oh, okay, at least they get, when you talk about it with them. And they may not get it in the moment when, a child like throwing something at them or swearing at them, but they get it when you talk about it of there's a reason that this is happening. And they want to avoid something. They want attention or they want me to give them something. So they understand that. But a lot of times what I've found is I feel like these poor people got trained by someone that came in and did a quick in-service, and they're like, there's 4 functions of it. There's automatic, which isn't going to happen too much in your gen ed classrooms, but maybe. There's attention, there's escape, and there's tangible. And like they gave them they showed them an ABC picture, and everyone's like, oh, wow, that's cool, great. And then all they learned was the escape extinction part of it all. So, you'll see the teachers and they turn their back on the kid who's hucking things at them. And the kid is, what do? Well, they throw bigger things at the teacher, and the poor teacher's just getting beat up. And you're sort of like, why are you doing that? And they're like, well, I don't want to give them attention. Like the lesson, all they were able to be taught was, I don't want to reinforce the wrong thing. And then it just leaves them. And then when you're the person who's like, actually, it's okay to reinforce it because you've given, I'm going to tell you why, this is why the ISCA is so important. Precursor, like nobody wants to hear it. Like it's too little, too late. They're tired of this. Now you're telling them the wrong thing. I know.
The moon at that point.
And in the end, you say like, oh, wait, did I just sound smart to only myself and sound like a jerk to everybody else in the environment? Because there's such that subtlety. And I've found I've been able to skip a lot of that because I worked in a school all the time. But I know for folks who are consulting to schools, they find themselves, they're either doing the in-service where they didn't get enough time to teach all the subtlety, or they're doing the follow-up where they're pretty much telling the teachers everything you learned about ABA is wrong. And then the teachers are left thinking, maybe ABA is stupid and I don't want to do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this isn't meant to be a flex. It's honestly just meant to like reassure people a little bit. I think that there might be people listening who feel a bit weird or some might feel attacked. And I just want to be really clear that like, I have the privilege of having been in my current position for like 12 years now. Like I will tell people like, you might have attended a training of mine in which I told you these are the 4 functions. Like you might have witnessed me going into a classroom, modeling a procedure. And I'm telling you, on reflection, I've decided not to do that anymore. And this is based on, I'm not saying contingency then, but it's based on the contingencies that I've experienced from a social validity standpoint, from learning new tactics, et cetera. So I think we should be gentle with ourselves and each other. I mean, if you're a true determinist, if you really have a circumstances view, we know that we're all doing the best we can, analysts included. But I do think we can be reflective. And I think we can all change. That's okay too.
Oh yeah, and please listen. Every story I tell where you're like, I can't believe anyone would do that. I'm telling the story because I'm the one who did that dumb thing.
Oh my gosh!
You're in the field long enough. Yeah, you're so right, John. It's that compassion to ourselves. Like, I tell the story because I did that. I don't want you to be in the same position. I want you to have some of that foreknowledge that I wish I'd had about building rapport, about trying to if I'm going to teach something, teach it to what needs to be taught to be meaningful in the moment, rather than I know science. Look at me. I just finished grad school. We don't want to be that smartsy pants about some of these things because it's not helpful.
And I'm like, I'm a little bit ashamed to be like, there's a story you said be proud of telling people for years about that 8-year-old who showed up and took off his shoes every day. And I'm like, we're not taking off anymore. And after a 45-minute sweaty wrestling match, I taught him we don't take our shoes off at school anymore. And the whole staff saw that I mean business. And that's another reason why BCBAs are great, because they don't back down. And it's like, man, like it's yucky that I did it. It's also yucky that for years I shared that as an example of like how like extinction works in schools too. And it's just like, I don't know. I think it'd be cool if we can kind of own some of that a little bit. Like some of the things you've been taught in your teacher prep programs that you heard the last analyst say, we thought we were extrapolating from, some clinical data sets, and we now, we have a different perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we can take a page.
I never wear shoes at work, so.
I'm glad I know you now, but maybe it's a good thing I didn't know you in 2007. We might not have gotten along. I don't know. JK.
I was just going to say we can take a page. We can take a page from psychology at large as well, and understanding how they've recognized some of their own past actions and then responded to them, made apologies, and plan to move forward with their field intentionally to move towards better practice.
Mm-hmm. I think like one of the beautiful things about behavior analysis, there's like a Don Bear quote in his like Letters to the Lawyer thing where he's like, every time you have like an outcome that isn't what you want, it's a gift. You have like another data point that you can learn from and do better from. So can we just look at this as it's been a learning opportunity? We made a good faith effort to succeed through those pathways, and now we've learned from it. So we don't have to keep repeating the same mistake.
So, John, a lot of what we're talking about today is certainly, to inform folks who are either going to be working in schools or have been working for a little bit of time in schools, or maybe they've done it for a long time and they sort of just want to hear, some other folks kind of, impressions on improvement ways. I mean, what are the things that you think, and I know the articles went into it some too, but, you're working with students a lot yourself on these same topics. What are some things that we could sort of do pre-supervision or during the practicum to support behavior analysts just not getting stuck in some of these kind of traps that we've had to learn our way out of just through years and years of making mistakes and reflection? Like what can we do ahead of time? Like, what should they be learning? What should we be teaching?
Let's see. I think as far as training programs, I think one issue is we just all have to understand that there's just not enough time to teach everything. So like, as I'm here saying this stuff, junior analysts might be like, how did you have time for all that? Well, guess what? Like when I was getting trained, I was not getting, at that time, there was not a required course in theory or supervision or ethics or OBM. So I have a lot of gaps in my skill set. At the same time I have this. And I think, to Jackie's point, like sometimes people are capitalizing on an opportunity, or maybe someone's seeking it out as a PD thing. So I think we have to be realistic that like, it's not, you can't cram all the info in. So, I think there's that. I think that if training programs are like, okay, just pretend that we have a little bit of time carved out, where would you prioritize? I think that soft skills that would be school relevant would be very important. So to the extent that like, I think interacting with the family of a child who's in a public school might be different from the family, of a child where they're like paying your clinic or their insurance company is. It's just not the same context. There's a lot that's different about it. I think, you talking to someone who is hired by a school system is really different from someone who like works for you, the RBT that you're their boss. So I think that like across the kinds of people we're talking about, not to mention talking to an SLP who works in a school is different from one who works for your clinic. Like, so there's just, again, different soft skills there. We've talked a lot about the case law. We're saying there's not a huge amount of it, but I think we should know it well enough that we can help with that. So understanding, I think, the legal landscape, both for special ed and otherwise, would be really important. I'm not trying to dunk on this guy, but we were at this conference last fall, and like some analyst was kind of the misunderstanding that like schools were just fighting him on not pulling kids to be in his clinic all day just because they were like, weren't particularly concerned with the students, medical outcomes or, behavioral progress. And I think he just wasn't aware of those FAPE mandates that we were just talking about earlier. The school was like, well, we have an IEP, we have goals we promised to achieve. And if the kids aren't here, Like we have
Yeah.
all kinds of other problems that we have to deal with. And that's real. I think also, again, too, like school-based collaboration skills, I think, I mean, again, maybe it's building on other coursework or practice we have around collaboration or consultation, but I think there's some school-specific ones. I mean, the kinds of meetings you go into where there's, a principal who wields lots and lots of power, but the amount of information they have is variable. SPED leadership, which they have some specific sorts of skills and priorities, families or advocates, related service providers. Like it's very realistic for you to sit down at a table with people representing 4 or 5 really different perspectives, histories, trainings, worldviews, et cetera. And, you have to, make things better, not worse. And I think that requires, some real specific kind of like awareness, situational awareness of what's going on and knowing a bit of background of what maybe they're likely to be meaning when they say this or that. I think finally, advocacy. And I think that came from one of the articles. We've been talking about advocacy a lot. I think that analysts can be really phenomenal partners for advocacy, both at that kind of individual student level, but also at a systems level. I think if we know about that there are solutions, if we know that there's ways to make better use of the IEP or the time and services, I think we can speak up and we can be peacemakers. We can help to solve some of those problems around how we're going to get this in, So that's, I hope we can cram all that into those training programs. I know you guys have so much extra time. So
yeah, I think the soft skills are definitely a key component. I can't remember if it was the Stevenson or if it was I think it was one of the Stevenson articles, but that idea of a lot of the advocacy work, we're talking about systems level advocacy or individual level advocacy. So much of it needs to be focused on the individual versus being a shill for ABA.
Oh yeah,
which
it was one of the Stevenson.
I think that makes sense on the one hand. On the other, I think there is still that challenge, and I think even with we've got like Broadhead's 2015 collaboration article. I think we have more writing about this, but it's still very hard when you're in a setting to legally know that ABA is not a legal requirement or a legal right of a child. They have to be making effective progress using evidence-based practices. Well, we know ABA is an evidence-based practice, but is it the only evidence-based practice? And I think that's always an area that even I still feel like I can't ever quite wrap my head around. How do I both ethically, make sure everyone understands that ABA is number one in my heart and in the science, while following the law of the state and the United States and Massachusetts in my case, and without looking like I think everything else that anyone else on my team is recommending is witchcraft and stupid and I shouldn't have to follow it. And I think a lot of those soft skills really would allow more for that listening and that individual focus and that ability to sort of hear what other people are doing, retranslate. This probably is still behavior analytic. A lot of things are behavior analytic, even though we don't consider them, ABA necessarily. Have you ever found any good ways to sort of, get out of that kind of those ethical / legal / practice tangle?
Let's see. I mean, I think that there's a couple little hacks that I have, I guess. And I mean, I think, again, some of them is I think that designing like database tests for something, I think can be an easy way for the team to like agree that we're going to try this, but like I'm not giving away that we're never going to come back to it. So I was mentioning that earlier, but I mean, it can be something on the level of like a lot of school systems in Tennessee, a child might show up and there's been child's not been exposed to any kind of behavioral intervention. So like an experienced special ed teacher or SPED director might say, before we do an FBA and BIP, I think there might be some kind of tier 1 or even like tier 2 sorts of supports that might do the trick. And the issue is, a family might say, well, hold on a second, like that's not really codified in the way that the BIP is. So I'm feeling kind of uncomfortable. Getting advice to not fall for that trick. And so what you do is you say, well, how about this? Let's have a time-based database trial period. And, either we see this outcome and we say, well, we were wrong and we'll use this data as like baseline for FBA and away we go, or, it succeeds and we all agree that time is better spent, doing something else. That analyst was helping with the behavior support plan rather than the FBA. So I think that kind of thing can help. I think that, without getting in the middle of it, exposing families to advocacy resources. So that can be either that you have some responsibly sourced resources that are available, knowing of some local advocacy organizations that they can be connected to, or a community of that kind of like basically realizing if there's stuff that I can't say, but if you connect them with the right person, they'll say it. And I've gotten in trouble at points in my career for kind of saying that someone should talk to an advocate. But at this point, I don't know. Like, I feel like analysts should be able to sort of, I'm very privileged. So it would be nice if we can try to aspire to say something like advocacy in general would be a good thing. Families show up and like them just like reading the procedural safeguards book is not going to be enough. And like advocates can guide them, you know, and we are transparent with them. It's not going to be that bad. So, I mean, I think I don't know, like before I was in California, I was like, oh my gosh, like advocates are so scary because the other schools, the other states where I'd been was an issue. And I think in California, I ran across some of like the most feared advocates in Southern California, and like working with them, a couple of them just said like some really eloquent things, like, you know, like, I'm here to educate. And, you know, like I found that when I was using my best skills around being transparent and sharing data and so on, they were like, oh, cool. Like if this guy's not trying to pull a fast one, like I'm listening, like I want my client to get an outcome. The point isn't to stick it to the school system. This just needs to not be like so loosey-goosey that, you know, this family has nothing to stand on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there is something to be said for the behavior analyst and you know, our focus on determinism, our focus on hypothesis testing, that does sometimes allow us, it becomes a little bit easier to get out of some of the adversarial relationships that you can find yourselves in with either other providers or educational advocates or parent advocates or parents or principals or, you know, any number of people who might be mad at any meeting that you go to. Just being able to focus on the student, focus on what are the results we're looking for, how might we find out if we are or not reaching them, agreeing to, you know, those kind of short-term experiments like you were talking, not experiments, but those short-term periods where we have an intervention, we're going to look experimentally at the data we get from this and then make a decision together that we all agree, if we see blank, then we'll do this. If we see blank, then we'll do that.
It's not always going to be that ABA is the right choice for every kid too. So I know like that was the point of one of those articles at the end, like you were saying, Rob, is it's FAPE is about access to effective intervention, but that doesn't automatically mean ABA. And sure, there are many things that we can break apart and say like, well, there were contingencies involved here, right? And that's probably why we saw an effective outcome. But I mean, for every kid, I'm not going to recommend, you know, blanketly that ABA is the intervention for them because it really might not be.
I totally agree. And I think maybe can we think about sometimes the skills we have might allow for an intervention that was already socially valid for the folks there to work. And so that's like, for instance, you show up and the teacher has a reinforcement system and you're like, do you want a new system or you want to fix this one? And they're like, I mean, if you can fix this one, that'd be great. It just doesn't work anymore. The kid doesn't like the stuff they liked in May. Here's in September. And you're like, well, I can do a quick preference assessment. And you swap out reinforcers and dang it, it works. And the teacher's off and running. Like, yes, that is an application of behavioral technology, but like, you know, you walk away from there really helping them, I think, to have solved something. Or, you know, I think back to a consulate case where I went out and watched this kid and like, whether his head was up or down in the reading group was like, it was under the control of whether it was like a reading activity where he was, you know, being completely humiliated by having to read aloud for his peers, or whether it was something where you could kind of fake it and didn't look dumb. And so I just saying like that, just being able to see patterns, being able to use data, again, you can look at something as simple as like, are we in the right reading group? Or like, yeah, like, you know what, like I could design a fancier reinforcement system, but like, if the real problem is just you don't have preferred reinforcers, I can help you with that. And then we'll go our separate ways.
Yeah.
It's a lot quicker too, right?
Absolutely.
It's a lot quicker. You already work with what's happening.
And teachers appreciate speed, efficiency, not having to redo something different because somebody else came in and said, I like this one better. What was it? One of the teachers in the collaboration article said like, oh, they just come in and they have their 3 favorite interventions and they make me do them.
Exactly.
Do you know what a Seagull supervisor is? Or in this case, a Seagull consultant. It's the person who flies in, makes a lot of noise, shits all over everything, and leaves.
I'm going to use that. I love that. Yeah. That is.
You don't want to be that one.
That's so true. That's so true. But I think that comes back to that thing of like misunderstanding why you're there. Like, you know, if you're like, well, you know, the SPED director suspected that there was something rotten over here. So you like, well, yeah, I found something rotten, you know, and I shit on it. You know, like that's like, you know, like if you think that's as deep as it went, like, I don't know, like maybe you know something I don't know, but like that's probably not why people called you in, you know, and
Yeah.
I don't know.
Exactly.
So, John, we talked a lot about working with teachers. We talked about working with families and outside, some outside providers or advocates. We talked a little bit about the law. I don't know if this is going to end up being a question or if I just want to complain on Mike and then, you know this stuff really well. So you'll either tell me what I should do differently or be empathetic. Either way, I learned something new. What is your advice for when you are working with other BCBAs in which you're maybe at a different side of the table? So you're working in the school or you're working for the school, the school is your stakeholder, let's say. And then you have the kind of the outside BCBA who is coming at it with very limited knowledge of schools and with more of that, this is what worked in clinic, therefore this is what you should do in a school kind of attitude. And I try very hard. I work with a lot of people, so I tend to know enough of them at this point in my career where it typically I understand where they're coming from. We're able to sort of discuss it. But I'll get people who come in, I feel like they're newer to the field a lot of times, and they're just, you get the sense they've never been in a school since they graduated from school, and they're just making all these demands. I think the parent likes them because they've probably been helping them a lot at home, which is awesome. But then it sort of turns into almost like a fight of like, why won't the school do these things that I'm recommending, even though I'm not at the school? My first impulse is to say, we would love for you to come visit the school for a bit and see this. However, I always feel like that's going to come off as, I want to brush you off because I know insurance won't pay for you to come visit the school and therefore you never will come visit the school. So I'm just going to make you look bad and win the argument by default, which is not what I would be trying to do, but I worry that's what they're going to think, which is just going to make it worse. What can we do in situations like that for folks who just find themselves almost at odds with their own teammates in some ways in the ABA field?
I mean, I'll tell you, I think you guys, you probably have a lot more experience with this than we do. I think that Massachusetts has a history of having more analysts much earlier. And I think just much more ABA infrastructure. I think like it was, when I stepped into this job, like I saw some survey data and there were many counties in Tennessee that report like where there wasn't a single BCBA reporting serving that county. There were families who were in service deserts. So I don't know if Massachusetts has that or not.
School system, John?
No, just like in general, they surveyed like all the BCBAs in the state and like which counties do you serve? Since like 2013, and they were like,
in any capacity.
Like, yeah, it'd be like if you needed general help and you happen to be in like Hardeman County, you're out of luck. And so what's happened is like, I think thanks to a few things. One, it was like, we went from there being one behavior analysis program at Vanderbilt, which I attended. And then like, I think there've been 4 for several years now. And like, they're in all the grand regions of the state. And so I think there's been many, many, many more analysts, as well as I think Tennessee was like the 50th state to finally add an insurance mandate. So like the possibility for working with analysts, because there's been a sharp uptick. And like right now, I think some of the fights that are going on, they might be ones that happened in Massachusetts a long time ago, or maybe other things have changed and these weren't fights. But like we're hearing what you're talking about is an extremely sensitive and hot topic right now. Like SPED directors across the state are like, how do we work with these people? I've got like a family showing up with a note saying my kid needs 40 hours of ABA, needs to be ready to the IEP. The SPED directors are saying when will this kid eat and have recess? Like how is this going to work? Like they need pull out, but then they're not going to have time with I don't think they're not hopeless. They're just asking for help. They're like, what will we do? And the Department of Education is looking to us to work on this. This is going to be one of our big missions over the next year is look what other states have done. We've looked at some of the documents from the Virginia Department of Education on ABA in schools, and maybe it's, developing kind of some guidance to share. But I don't necessarily have a solution, but what I think some of those solutions are going to be would be, aside from kind of some mutual education on the context, I think try to find building pathways for people to have better conversations around goals and aims. Because I think that what's happening is, I think that because of some vocabulary differences or billing or funding issues, I think there may be a lot of opportunities that are getting overlooked. I think, for instance, if an analyst working in a clinic is saying like the core issues I'm looking for are, improvements in functional communication, I'm looking for this, my client to become better, being able to engage in longer chains of behavior that are non-preferred, those are things you can really easily map onto a school context if you're willing to find a way to say, you can work on that functional communication goal in so many ways at school. Let's just make sure the team has an idea of what procedure we're using, that we're thinking through, who's teaching it, who's owning it, that kind of thing. Or I don't know. I think that there's like a lot of schools, honestly, I think aren't hip to the number of ways in which they can document a skill deficit that would be behavioral in nature. Like my soapbox the past years, we've been working on BIP and FBA improvement is, we tell people that the current mandate right now from the state is you have to have a BIP goal. It's like a SMART goal for replacement behavior. And there's supposed to be goals in the IEP for all suspected areas of deficit. And I think a lot of people are like, all right, I'm going to write one behavior goal, and it's going to be that this kid won't hit anybody for a while. And I'm like, hold on a second. If you just document the child can neither protest or request, you can add a communication goal. Why would you not? We've talked to the state. Like, do you need an SLP to co-sign? They're like, no, you don't. They're like, it would be smart. It'd be good practice to reach out and see if they have input. But you can add a communication goal, like as a behavior analyst with the team, if you have something like that, or if you're like, this child will not tolerate being asked to do something and staying in that area for more than 20 seconds. You can write a pre-vocational goal around the idea that for this child to be employable, or, so again, I think these are like, I don't know, I would hope would be goals that analysts working in clinical context would say, no, we can absolutely work on the same stuff. Maybe we call it something different, but like there's common cause, and whether it's my billing or your team, we can iron out the details, but like, we don't need to be like competing for, there's like a finite number of hours in the child's day when they're going to have literally the stamina and the bandwidth to like engage with structured learning. And we have to have some time left over for the unstructured learning that otherwise is going to really mess them up developmentally. So like, can we like be efficient with it?
I like that. I feel like I'm already starting to think of like, I should have said it like this. But that going back to the goals, going back to the objectives, or at least going back to the goals and then thinking about the objectives rather than getting into that big jump of, okay, I know what the goal is. Here's how we're going to solve it. Here's how we're going to look at this. Like taking that step back, getting everyone on the same page with, and we want to work on this because, and then we can get into the modality. We can get into how does this work, the logistics from a place of everyone agrees. And sometimes it's hard to remember to go back to that place of everybody agrees, but it's so key regardless of the setting you're in. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
I think one conversation we've had with the state is, again, these are non-BCBA, but they want BCBAs to be better engaged, is talking about, okay, there's medical necessity, and that's what you're typically going to have in order for there to be an insurance billing paradigm. And then there's like educational relevance, and that's what it needs to be for school. And you can Venn diagram it if you feel like it, but like, that's where I think that we can find ways to work together.
Well, John, it has been so awesome getting the chance to talk about this policy. I do want to move into the last section of our show. Well, actually, the second to last section of our show, the dissemination station. Oh, there we go. Okay. I wasn't sure the train was coming along.
It's coming around the bend.
So, I mean, John, we talked a lot about sort of some things BCBA should know, whether they want to work in schools, work, directly in schools, or just sort of generally work with schools as outside consultants, or just as they're called upon to be a team member that has to be a part of the team at the school setting. Maybe they're working in the home, though. What do you see as sort of the future of BCBAs when it comes to education? I know we always have the doom and gloom every couple, conferences or talks. You hear like, oh, no one likes BCBAs. Oh, ABA is going to be the way of the dinosaurs if we keep doing what we're doing. Why do we just write papers for ourselves? Education does to me feel like we could make we've made huge impacts, but we could make like a you can't get rid of us impact because we have a lot there. I mean, do you see that as well being a kind of a role of BCBAs more, or just something we sort of do tangentially to our other work? Like, kind of where do you see the future of behavior analysis and the schools going?
Yeah, I mean, I actually feel very, very optimistic about where we're headed. I think that what we can do is, I think we can advocate for doing the right thing from an ethical standpoint, from like the standpoint of what we know about our clients. And I think that we can work together to be smart enough to figure out how can we do that in ways where there will be reinforcers for the people who have the power. So things like, if you're able to, apply effective behavior analytic programs that build the skills and capabilities of the students you're serving such that they can be served in a less restrictive setting, you're saving big money on per pupil costs. If there's a child, in the state where we are, you might have like an 80% savings in what's spent on that child if that's the difference between them being in a special day school or them being in an integrated school, just right there. So for every kid, like whether you go back to like Joey's enhanced choice model papers, a couple of those kids later on moved to a less restrictive school. And those, that's big money. And so if people get on board because you're saving them money and not because they cared about this kid who's marginalized and no one liked anyway, I don't know, like we can be moving towards the same thing for different reasons. I think that's okay. I think looking at risk management is a huge thing. I think that there's, administrative complaints, workers' comp claims, litigation. There's a lot of things where I think we have the technology to get ahead of some of those things. And whether it's, was going to say this earlier. I mean, like things like analysts who feel comfortable with something like figuring out when there's a problem and looking at fidelity and figuring out, is it because fidelity is too low or too inconsistent? And that's why the child is still blowing up. I mean, that's the kind of thing where you can save from a kid, basically being at the center of administrative complaint where the parents say the BIP was never in place and therefore my child was expelled and like didn't get any of these opportunities. We can help schools by designing and upholding and training people to make sure that BIPs, like we found the biggest gaps in Tennessee BIPs we've been looking the last several years, or in BIP training being accurately described in the BIP and BIP progress monitoring protocols being there. So literally you can have a great assessment, you can have a great plan. The big breakdown was people didn't have a plan that they were held to around teaching the people who are going to do it and making sure it happened. And this is like our bread and butter. Like that is, hopefully everything FBA and BIP, but like we should be most confident, like teaching people behavioral procedures and then using procedural fidelity data to help provide that feedback and coaching. So I think those are big. I think other things that have set us up really well is awareness. And I think there's been a whole story of awareness that's building forward. Again, 12 years ago, I guess, when I started to try it, I remember there was like a survey that had gone out to administrators across Tennessee asking what the things they're most worried about. And one of the top things was they knew that their educators didn't have enough capacity or knowledge around FBA or BIP for Tier 3 supports. They knew that back then. And I think that their awareness of the necessity for that has just grown over time. And now with there actually being BCBAs in the state, I mean, a couple of years ago, it was really rare for there to be a school system who had ever worked with the BCBA. And now it's rare to find one who has never heard of it before. And that is like a huge shift. Like what we're trying to do is making sure we don't poison the well. We want to make sure we don't run roughshod. And I think these articles are sharing, you really can. Those teachers who were surveyed in the Squires paper, I think it's like, they've had their toes stepped on. They've been insulted in some cases. Having a blank slate is sometimes worse than when it's already muddied up. But I think that the people want the help. And so anyway.
That's very well said, John. Last question. If everybody out there listening who's a BCBA, whether they do or do not want to have anything to do with the school system in their country, or at least in America, because we're talking about kind of American law, what would be the one acronym that you think they should probably make sure they remember? They don't have to like get it tattooed on themselves like a memento or anything, but like maybe they read it on a Post-it or, they say it a few times just to get in the habit of knowing what it is. What's the best, most useful acronym for a BCBA to know related to education?
I'll tell you what, this might sound really dumb, but I said those other ones earlier. What I think in Tennessee right now, I think the number one acronym that behavior analysts need to, it's not so much know the acronym, but what to do about it, is behavior intervention plans, BIP, because this is like, when I was a teacher, I was like another piece of paper. I know what to do behavior analytically. They're all the same. It's garbage. And I see right now, I think that behavior intervention plans that is like our best in right now to help, because there's a mandate in Tennessee, other places, if a child's behavior impedes learning, there must be a BIP. If there must be a BIP, there must be an FBA. If the BIP is there, it's part of the IEP process. Therefore, it must be followed. And this is and this is why, our team has just doubled down. It was written in our contract. I remember being like, oh crap, I know that these are tough topics. I was a little overwhelmed 5 years ago when we knew we were going to have to go on this journey. But, we kept our head down. I think we've made some progress. I think this is where analysts, if they can really learn about how can I take my evidence-based practices and get them in there? How can I really individualize in a way that makes all those team members feel good? How can I set it up where it's not just I wrote it and I'm gone, but there's going to be the training and the follow through, and we're going to see the outcomes. I really think that's where we can show our value and kind of on our own turf. And it's going to be saving money and risk management and all that kind of stuff I was just talking about. So BIP. That's it.
Okay. Well, John Staubitz, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciated all your knowledge. We loved looking at these articles and getting a chance to think about this very important topic together. I know it's one that's very important to all of us, but I know you and I doing this for as long as we have, it's always good to get a chance to talk shop. If folks want to reach out, and maybe because I've mentioned it probably on the show, I definitely mentioned it to lots of people at the schools I've consulted to maybe see some of the awesome resources you have in relation to classrooms and all the Triad team. I know you don't make it all by yourself, but some of the work on FBAs, some of the additional kind of documentations and checklists can be very helpful if you're in that part of your own state process for improving the BIP, procedures, is there a great way they could get a hold of you?
I mean, people are certainly welcome to reach out to me. I'm not great about email these days, but people can certainly try. I'm john.stabbits@vumc.org. But honestly, I think a starting point, I think people should look up Triad Vanderbilt Kennedy Center or Triad VKC and go to our webpage and click around. It'd be quickly apparent where there's resources for educators. And I think that means that's broadly interpreted. And you can look at some of the services that we're doing. I mean, I'm really proud of the fact that years ago, a lot of what we did was these student-specific consults, but now we've built in these FBA and BIP training programs, and people can look at those materials. They can, we have webinar series and things. There's archived recordings people can check out of people like, what are you actually doing? And so, I think if people went to the Triad webpage, looked for educator resources, then looked at the intensive behavior part, which is kind of everything that I work on, again, with a team of like 15 people doing all the work. I just get to take all the credit. I think that's where people can really, there's a ton that it's open source and available. I think if people are seeing something they're curious about, or there's something not there they want to know about it, I hope they'll email me, and I'd love to try to help.
Beautiful. All right. And again, a ringing endorsement from me. I've been to that site. It's in my inbox. I go there pretty frequently when I'm like, I got to remember what that. I learned about that one in grad school. I got to remember that one management technique. What was it called? A lot of videos, a lot of examples, a lot of pictures. It's really, really great. Great resource, even for old fogies, like me. I still can learn something new from there. So it's excellent resource.
Well, thanks for the plug. Yeah, there's new stuff there all the time now, and I'm excited about all the new stuff that's showing up. So hope people will come back.
Once again, big thank you to John Stabbits for coming on the show and talking all about practicing ABA and practicing being a BCBA within a school context. We're very, very excited to finally have him on the show. I know when we've seen him at various conferences, we're like, John, we got to get you on. We got to get you on. So we finally did it. We're very excited. I hope you learned a lot. I know we had a lot of fun and learned a lot ourselves. I want to remind everybody before we go of a couple things. Number one, we want to say thanks so much for listening to our show. We'd really appreciate it if you subscribed on Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can also listen to these on YouTube or on our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can find links to the articles that we discussed with John and to all of our previous episodes. If you want even more ABA Inside Track content every month, go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe to get episodes early, to get access to our listener choice episodes and book club episodes before everybody else, and with free CEs as well as discounts for other CEs. Again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. And of course, we can't end the podcast without the last section of the show, pairings. Diana, please help us through this pairings dilemma we're in. What do we pair this episode with?
All right. Yes. Well, pairings is the part of the show where I tell you about past episodes you might want to check out if you liked this one and want to know more. So we've talked about schools and working in schools and collaboration in schools on several different occasions. So let me tell you what some of those are. They include, in no particular order, episode 208, FBAs in schools. Episode 231, we talked about the enhanced choice model and emotional behavioral treatment with Joey Staubitz. Episode 262, collaboration and leadership in schools with Bruce Tenor. Episode 102, PBIS. Episode 124, school consulting with Matt Coria. Episode 274, public policy. And episode 287, teaching compassionate care soft skills. All of those came into part of the conversation today. So you can go check those out. I also like to recommend a snack to go with the episode. Today's snack is, see if you can figure out why, Rob, a tuna sandwich, an apple, bag of chips, and your 64-ounce size water bottle. Why?
Is it my school lunch?
It's your school lunch. It's your BCBA consultant school lunch that maybe you eat in the car.
The one thing I have never learned in all these years working in a school is how I am supposed to buy school lunch. So I tend to have to just bring from home.
You don't have like a punch card or something? Or
there's a code you put in. I'm sure I could figure. I've taught other students to do it. I don't actually know what my code would be. And I've been where I currently work there too long to ask. I'm too embarrassed.
Too embarrassed.
So, oh well.
All right. And that was pairings. Please enjoy.
All right. Thank you so much, Diana. Some final pieces of information. I want to make sure to say thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturry for interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. And for those of you who would like to get one learning CE for listening, don't forget our second secret code word, Jurassic. Jurassic. It was a period with dinosaurs. There was like a movie made about that. It was like a park, remember? That Jurassic Park that you could go to. It was fun to visit, if I remember. I only watched the beginning of the movie. It seemed like a great place to visit. But I don't know. You don't see too many of them around anymore.
Super safe.
Super safe.
Contained.
Totally great.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.